to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Speaker, similar to the last piece of legislation, the Labor Party will support this bill. At the very least, to Select Committee, we reserve the right, as I said with the last piece of legislation, to examine the detail of the bill. I must say from the outset, unlike the last piece of legislation we dealt with that had sort of languished around the order paper, well, not even got, I think, on the order paper since the respected Minister of Commerce, the former Minister Simon Power, had kicked it off, and this Minister had let it languish to the detriment of our international reputation, including, as I said in the last piece of legislation, New Zealand being struck off the European Union whitelist. This legislation has, I think, at least to a high degree, been put together in a far more positive and constructive way in terms of consultation with the industry and with the sector. Cartels make markets, as we know, less competitive and lower output or increase prices to consumers. They are insidious. There has been activity in respect of cartels within the New Zealand context, and there are cases, for instance, in the Woods chemical case in New Zealand, the cartel was estimated to have caused an overcharge of $9.7 million over 5 years, but at that time and currently, of course, the penalties are wholly inadequate in that the total penalties came to $5.4 million. So it is timely, again, for the reasons I outlined in the last piece of legislation, that we are brought into line and our reputation as a country and as commercial entrepreneurs is managed and carefully protected, but more importantly, we are brought into line with other major trading partners such as the US, Australia, the UK and Canada, who have criminal sanction regimes already in place. I think it would be fair to say that the time for this legislation has certainly come, and the time for us to get very serious about the detection and the process of dealing with and the penalties associated with that process, getting serious about those, has come indeed. Cartels, of course, can be difficult to detect, and to ensure that they are adequately discouraged, our view is that substantial criminal sanctions are required. And I do note, as the Minister did, that within the bill, criminal penalties are up to 7 years imprisonment, 3 times the commercial gain or 10% of the turnover, and I believe up to $10 million. These are substantial criminal sanctions for hardcore cartel activity. The bill also helps, obviously, to promote the deterrence of hardcore cartels while not deterring efficiency and enhancing or deterring efficient collaborative activity. So it takes nothing away from entities that want to collaborate appropriately. Cartels, of course, as I've said, are an illegitimate transfer of wealth from consumers to businesses. This bill will bring us into line, as I've said, with other countries, but especially with Australia, who introduced these sanctions as far back as 2009. And I suppose without sort of rehearsing arguments, again, it does beg the question in respect of priorities. I'm assuming, and I take nothing away from the government's process of consulting, having exposure drafts with the industry, but one wonders when Australia dealt with this issue in 2009, why we have sort of been dragging the chain on this issue. It's now, halfway through 2012, and this bill appears before the House. So I suppose my message to the Minister and the government would be, the government sets its own priorities, the government sets its own agenda. We have heard that there's a 120-point plan or plans. There's so many plans, this government's sort of running out of paper and ink. There's a difference between having a plan on a piece of paper and actually implementing it, executing that implementation and making it happen. And when our biggest trading partner, Australia, has had legislation in place since 2009, tough sanctions for hardcore cartel activity, I don't think it's incumbent on us to sort of be the junior partner in poor relation and sort of languish for 2 or 3 years until somebody turns their mind to actually introducing a piece of legislation. So again, I say to the Minister, obviously there is some bipartisan support for this, because it's in all our interests in respect of our country to ensure that our commercial and country reputation is protected and enhanced. But I will be asking the Minister, and I'm sure the Select Committee will want to know again, what exactly are the priorities for this government? This legislation may not sort of turn the lights on for many in the media, or it may not be some sort of ruggedly populist activity or populist policy that's going to sort of light up hundreds of thousands or millions of the populace, but it is a damn important piece of legislation, and I believe, and the Labor Party believes, it should have had a greater priority than, for instance, other pieces of legislation we've dealt with, like the John Banks Regulatory Reform Bill, which was awe-inspiring in its stupidity of repealing 31 acts that are spent or don't exist. The government thought that was a greater priority until John Banks came a gutser, of course, and then he disappeared without trace, like the Invisible Man. But they thought a bill that repealed 31 acts that basically have no effect on anybody, that was a greater priority than this piece of legislation and the previous piece of legislation we've dealt with just a few moments ago in this House. So you've got to ask of this Minister of Commerce, where do his priorities and that of his government lie? The sort of 31 acts that don't exist, or this? And this is important. And if you've been in business, and I know many, including myself and many members of the House, of this House have been in business, they know the importance of appropriate competition law, of appropriate regulation that unleashes the sort of esprit de corps and the spirit of entrepreneurship in this country, and also allows our commercial entities to act appropriately and make deals in other jurisdictions, knowing there are international safeguards. So if we don't line up, and Australia has these institutional requirements and we don't, then which is the more attractive market to do business in if you're looking as an international company, New Zealand or Australia? So I just say again to the Minister, where are the priorities, where's the work program, and why have we waited so long? We know, of course, that at least 6,000 companies from 57 countries have been alleged or proven members of international cartels. And that comes from the AAI working paper that has been around for some time. That is international research. So 6,000 companies in 57 countries have been alleged or proven members of international cartels. The total known effective sales by international cartels is some $16 trillion. $16 trillion. That is a substantial amount of money. And it gives us motivation to get this bill in an appropriate shape to ensure that the detail, that it is examined in detail and progresses through this Parliament in a timely way. The bill, as we are aware, will apply to some conduct outside New Zealand in order to capture all New Zealand cartels. It will make forming a cartel subject of pecuniary or criminal penalties and make any contracts formed involving cartels invalid. The banned cartel conduct, as the Minister has pointed to, are price fixing, that is, companies agreeing on a set price or discount, restricting output, companies agree to reduce supply of goods or services, market allocating, that is, agreeing to pursue different customers so as not to compete, or bid rigging, agreeing on prices to submit for tenders. These provisions only apply, of course, between companies who compete with each other, not between supplier and distributor or other vertical arrangements. Joint ventures between companies would also not be caught by this legislation. So I think, in essence, it is one of those moments where I think we can agree that the substance and the detail of this legislation is important. Those of us who have been in business know that. It is important, it will be supported. I would perceive, unless there's a sort of catastrophe, that the Labor Party will support this right through, and by catastrophe I say whether the government mismanages this in the same way that it's mismanaged things like asset sales and other important issues before this Parliament, because we believe, like all parties, that we have to ensure that the regime that business operates in, both domestically, allows our entrepreneurs to grow their businesses, to make the money, to put bread on the table, to employ people, because that is what business does. some decry business. Without business, we would not have economic growth. Some people decry economic growth, I think, in this Parliament, one or two interesting folks from the Flat Earth Society, but economic growth is important, as are exports. But I just say to the Minister, please get your priorities right. Please ensure that we don't have silliness like dealing with repealing acts that don't exist while legislation like this lies upon the table and languishes. It is important for New Zealand.
Jonathan Young.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to stand in support